This episode brought to you by Cafe Imports, Minneapolis-based importers of fine specialty green coffees. Independently owned and operated since 1993, Cafe Imports has been dedicated to decreasing its impact on the earth through renewable energy, carbon neutrality, and by supporting conservational efforts in places where quality coffee is grown and also where quality coffee is consumed. Where does your coffee come from? Welcome to the Lake Superior Podcast. I'm Walt Lindala.
And I'm Frida Waara. We are made stronger by story, and there's no better source than the continent's largest body of fresh water, Lake Superior.
So join us as we highlight the 5 national parks that ring this greatest of the Great Lakes, meet the people, tour the places, and learn about the projects that make these parks and body of water so remarkable.
This podcast made possible with the support of the National Parks of Lake Superior Foundation and Media Brew Communications.
I'm Walt Lindala.
And I'm Frida Waara.
Welcome once again to the Lake Superior Podcast. Today, Frida, a special guest joining us and joining our listeners. Tell us who we're talking to.
You know, Walt, the fur trade had great impact on Lake Superior, particularly in the northern Minnesota along the Pigeon River. And today's guest, Tim Cochrane, he has worked as a backcountry ranger, a historian, an anthropologist, all for the National Park Service. And that was in Michigan, Minnesota, and Alaska. His last assignment was as superintendent at Grand Portage National Monument. Now, he retired in 2017, but, not really. And today we're going to catch up with Tim and learn a little bit about what's keeping him busy at his desk.
Tim Cochrane is joining us, retired superintendent at Grand Portage National Monument, also an author. Welcome to the Lake Superior Podcast.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Glad to have you. Let's talk a little bit about this. I mean, Frida touched on it a little bit with your career. Spent your career with the National Park Service. How did that all get started for you?
That got started pretty much by luck. I knew I always wanted to be outside working, and I knew I wanted to be in pretty spots, beautiful spots. But how that turned into a Park Service career was I applied for some jobs, and I didn't get them, and then at the very last minute, somebody didn't take a job at Isle Royale National Park, and the next thing you know, I was a fire lookout there in 1976.
So you've done that, and you've moved on to various other positions. Let's talk about that a little bit. I mean, how did that job check those boxes for you?
Well, the good news about when you start, you spend more time outside and less time at a desk. So the starting parts are sort of alluring in a way. But, I worked as a fire lookout, and then I worked as a backcountry ranger, both on Isle Royale. And that's where I really got a sense of the place. Did that for 4 years and really got hooked on Isle Royale at the time. And then I just, through the career, I did go back for more schooling and different kinds of schooling, and that led to the job as a historian and then anthropologist in Alaska, and then coming back here to Grand Portage and working as the park manager there.
All those hats that you've had. How did that prepare you for the job at Grand Portage?
I think it kind of really helped me. When in Alaska, the job before I came down to Grand Portage, I worked with Alaska Natives a lot. That's really what my job was. And that really deepened my appreciation for Indigenous people and the relationship between them and park units. And, if you look around the West and Alaska, you'll see this amazing correspondence between Indigenous people and national park units. I mean, there's almost every one of them, when you think about it, there's 2 or 3, 4, 5, Native American groups around them. And when I happen to be in Alaska, for example, it's even more so. At Katmai, there are over 50 Native villages that are associated with Katmai National Park. So I got interested and got some experience, and that helped me come back down to Grand Portage here. And then working with the Grand Portage Band of the Lake Superior Chippewa, it just made me more appreciative of who I was working with, and the creativity that working with tribes really allowed us to move ahead and to move the monument ahead in its infrastructure, and first ever park movie, first ever heritage center, museum, on and on and on. So it just opened up all kinds of doors.
Well, one of the things, as you've outlined there, Tim, is that many of the national parks, they have a connection to the indigenous community, the Native American heritage, but it is somewhat different at Grand Portage. Could you tell us about that and how that partnership is different? What's there that's unique? Right,
you're right. There's a few things that makes Grand Portage different. One of them is the Native American history is not over, and you have the same group of people that were participating in a major part of the fur trade are the people that are right next door to the monument. In fact, you're in their reservation, so you have this continuity through time, and also this proximity to the group. So that's one thing. It's the history's not over, and you're dealing with the people that share that history. It's not history that's just in books or far away. And the other part is the Grand Portage people wanted to participate more in park management, and so they approached the monument and the National Park Service through a law called Tribal Self-Governance Act, and through that we have 24 years now of successive agreements where we share management of the monument with the Grand Portage Band. So they're very intimately involved in what we do and how we do it, and they also are involved at Isle Royale now as well. The agreement is expanded, and now they're helping out with some of the things that are being done at Isle Royale.
Mm-hmm. I do want to ask you this real quick, Tim. When we talk about the National Monument and Grand Portage National Monument, for those that aren't familiar with it, what is there? Because a lot of folks that check out this podcast are from places that are nowhere near Lake Superior. What is there for folks to experience? And you kind of touched on its uniqueness, but what are some of those elements?
Right, and that's a good point, because people assume a monument, you're going to go and there's going to be some sort of like historical, plaque or maybe an obelisk somewhere kind of thing. But the monument's actually quite large. It's almost 9 miles long, which is the Grand Portage Trail, and at either end there are larger acreage in which there are a campsite on one end for a jumping off spot to the boundary waters, and on the other end is a restored fur trade site. And there is a heritage center. One of my favorite spots is the canoe warehouse, where you would see some of the really large fur trade birch bark canoes. There's one there that's 36 feet long. There's also a really
36 feet long.
Yeah. And then there's a small one that was owned by a local family, and it's quite old. And you look up at it, and you can still see the wild rice kernels still stuck in the ribs of the canoe. So there's a lot to do there. The staff really knows the history. They like to interact with people. I think that's probably the most. You get a lot of good conversation and people answering your questions if you're interested at all in fur trade history, indigenous history, and how those are interrelated.
You know, Tim, I did a little background research on you, and I had someone tell me that you were at the table crafting that agreement between the Park Service and the tribe. And you just used the word creativity, which many times when it comes to bridging the gaps that come in cultures, we don't often use that word creativity, but How was it to be there and bring all of this together? You've got to be so proud of that relationship.
Well, yes, I am proud of it, but I'm hardly the architect of it. The primary mover of the agreement was Norman Deschamps, the late tribal chairman at Grand Portage. It was really his vision of trying to re-put back the Grand Portage people into what the monument does and talks about. So, yes, there was almost 3 years worth of negotiations, and there was lawyers everywhere. And the reason it took so long, and there was attorneys everywhere, is nobody had ever done one before. So what we were negotiating was an agreement that that would be used as a model elsewhere, but also there were just there was nothing to draw upon in the to use as a model on what it should look like. So we crafted it out of thin air, if you will, and what the law says and what we thought we could get done. And there's some people, particularly early on, that didn't want the agreement to go because they were worried that we were going to be, quote, giving the park away to a tribal group. And so there was some resistance among people interested in the park, and then among what I would call traditionalists within the Park Service. They were worried that this was going to be another way of giving away a park. And fortunately, we've won over those folks, and I think most everybody that looks at the agreement thinks it's a really good thing.
Change is always something that, whether you're with it or against it, it always is making things different. And in that whole vein right now, there is some talk about changing the name from the National Monument. Do you have an opinion on that?
I always have an opinion, whether it's a good one or not.
Yeah.
So the issue with the name of the monument is that, as you asked earlier, a lot of people don't understand what it is or what they might, if they drove all the way up to, northeast Minnesota, are they just going to look at, some stone put together kind of thing? So the idea would be to, if the name is changed, to give people a little bit better idea of what they might experience or see or what it's about. So, there's people putting on their thinking hats right now on what that might be. And everything, it kind of comes with the pros and cons kind of thing. Some people want to, including myself, use the Anishinaabe name for Grand Portage, which is, and forgive me for my pronunciation, but Gitche-O-Ningaming, International Park is my favorite. And the reason I like that is because the historic fur trade site, the actual depot that was there, was kind of a linchpin on what happened on the international border. Mm-hmm. And most of the fur traders were Canadian. And in fact, the Canadians recognized Grand Portage as a really important part of their history. So I like the idea of using the word international as well. Some people want to use something like Grand Portage Historical Park, and that wouldn't be too bad, but the only kind of detriment to that is it implies that things are over and it happened way back when. Mm-hmm. And what we really learned about the monument in the last 30 years is it's also a very, very, very old, ancient prehistoric trail. I mean, Iowa Oil Copper that you folks in the UP would know about, one of its main arteries to the west, or the main artery, was through Grand Portage and up the Grand Portage Trail. So for thousands of years, people have been using the trail. So is historic right, or what would be the right name for it. There's strengths and weaknesses for a number of the options.
I'm sure that this will be something that we'll be discussing too here on the podcast and more. Maybe even talk with you about it again sometime soon. We're talking with Tim Cochrane today on the Lake Superior podcast. He's retired superintendent of the Grand Portage National Monument and an author. And that ties into my question for you, Tim, that you've been retired technically since 2017, but not idle. You've written 4 books, and your 5th is out soon. Tell us a little bit about your latest work and some of the highlights of your other books that you've put out.
Okay. Well, yes, I like to research and write. And when I was the superintendent, I would try to squeeze in little hours of trying to do research, and then I felt guilty when I was doing that because I wasn't doing my real job. But the latest book is about an indigenous couple that grew up in the North Country, really mostly in Canada, and then in their adult lives was spent in the United States. They had their home in a place called Basswood Lake, which is now in the middle of the Quetico Superior Wilderness. And then they also had a summer place, a fishery on Isle Royale. Very, very remarkable people. John Linkletter, for example, was a mentor to a conservationist author, very famous on this side of the lake, Sigrid Olsen. Sigrid Olsen couldn't get enough of John Linkletter. He liked to travel with him, liked to hang out with him. And Linkletter was a mentor to Sig Olsen. Helen or Chikiwis Linkletter was an incredibly prolific maker of things, and through some crazy circumstances, mostly at Isle Royale, quite a number of her things that she made still exist. One example would be in the Park Museum at Isle Royale, there is the birch bark canoe that she made, and was the canoe that was used for the guiding that her husband, John, did with a number of people back in the late 1920s when they were looking at whether Isle Royale should be a park. So Linkletter's, Mrs. Linkletter made the canoe, and John hauled these people around trying to convince them that Isle Royale should be made into a national park. Pretty unique individuals, and they're quite well remembered, and also so many of Chikiwis's things that she made still exist. Like there's also in the park collection, there's this really beautiful birch bark moose call that she would make for people they could purchase from her if they went out with her husband, and John would call moose in so they could see moose, and then if they liked that enough, they could buy a moose call from Chikiwis.
And what about the mats? Was she also a mat maker?
She was, and that's kind of the most remarkable thing in the collection is she made these large cedar bark mats, which are, when I say large, if there's an average, they're probably about 4.5 feet by 7 feet, and they're woven with the inner bark from white cedar. So they're, and then lots of times she would dye the warp or the weft strips. So she would create this geometric colored design mat, and they were purchased by people, summer people, cottagers at Isle Royale, and ended up on walls as artwork. And then eventually, quite a number of them were given to Isle Royale National Park. And now they've been moved over to the collection at Grand Portage, a little closer to the home of where she's from and her relatives, and also reunited with the cedar mats that were made by Grand Portage people. And so now, between Chikiwis's cedar mats and the ones made by Grand Portage artisans, That's the largest collection of cedar bark mats, Anishinaabe cedar bark mats, anywhere in the world. So you were asking about what to see at Grand Portage. Well, there's something that you can't see at the Smithsonian or in Canada or out on the West Coast. It's quite a remarkable collection.
Oh, Tim, this book, I'm a board member of the National Parks of Lake Superior Foundation, which you are very familiar with because as superintendent, we always work so closely together. Is there a way that our organization can help you get this book published?
Yes. And what I have proposed, and I'm not sure what the foundation will do, but so back to the cedar bark mats. They're colored. Some are red, some are green, some are a dark blue. There's some fading on some, but there's some yellow on others. What we'd like to do is put a full color gallery of photographs in the book of these cedar mats. And that's what I've asked the foundation to think about, whether that be something they would be interested in. And the way this works is this is a win-win for a lot of folks, because if indeed the foundation was willing to do that, that can offset some of the costs of color photographs in a book. And for people listening to this, if they wanted to buy the book later on, it's going to be cheaper for them to buy. Yeah. So it's a way of exposing more people to one of the, really unique parts of the Isle Royale and Grand Portage collection.
We're talking with Tim Cochrane today on the Lake Superior podcast. He is retired superintendent of the Grand Portage National Monument and an author, as we were talking about this process of making books and getting the stories together. Obviously, you've been working on this one now that sounds like you're in a point here where you're ready to kind of wrap that one up. Is there any thoughts on another book after this one? I mean, you sound like you're voraciously into doing this. This is your fifth project. Is there something on the horizon?
Oh, it's pretty close on the horizon. During COVID times, we all do different things, right? Mm-hmm. And for me, that's squirreling away and researching and writing. And I've started, and I'm quite a ways away into another book about Isle Royale. And I'm tentatively titled this The Mystery of Mary Bruneau. And what the book's really going to be about is kind of untold stories in the 19th century, things that surprise people. And I'll give you for example. In the late 1870s, the legislature of the state of Michigan appropriated money to put a road across Isle Royale. And not too many people know that there was plans for a state road from, if you know the geography, more or less, Wendigo to McCargo Cove. And so those are the kinds of surprises that I want to bring to people's attention.
Tim, that would be an interesting one, because you should see Frida and I here in the studio. We're both like, a road? And then worrying about a road and all of that. But that's what this one's about then, hey?
Yeah, it's about trying to either mysteries or surprises is kind of the way what I'm really shooting for. Things that people really, really wouldn't probably even dream of it occurring. I'll give you another example. Same time period, McCargo Cove, people that know island history would know about copper mining. But in the tail end of the second era, in the early 1880s, there was a number of people working out there. By that time, things were winding down. But isolation at Isle Royale in the winter can be pretty tiresome. So what did two young guys do? They put together the mines team of horses, and they went over the ice from McCargo Cove to Pigeon River, that's the international border on the Minnesota side, to deliver mail and then returned to McCargo with bringing back the mail by a 2-team horse sleigh. Now, that's not probably an image or something that people would dream of occurring. Now, I'm looking at the lake right now and some of the ice on the lake, but it's just not solid right now. But and this one time there was 2 guys that decided, I'm out of here on a lark, and brought the mail to essentially Grand Portage, and then returned with the mail to go back to their families there at McCargo Cove. So it's kind of full of things like that I've known about, but didn't have a chance to follow up on. But kind of surprises or things that, I wouldn't have guessed that occurred on the island. So,
Tim, I need that. Now you got to make it backpack size. Because you got to be, when you're huffing and puffing down the Greenstone or wherever you happen to be, and you whip it out and you go, did you know, guys, this was going to be a road? I've not hiked end to end. I've circumnavigated in my kayak, but I could say it would be really wonderful, on a day when perhaps the winds are really kicking up and you're at McCargo Cove, kind of making your way around that North Shore, and you say, did you realize somebody actually crossed that ice with a horse team? Oh, my goodness. Great stories. And how, part of our intro to this podcast says we're made stronger by story. I think in so many ways, just listening to you today gives me the sense of opportunity. Just, you can't say something's impossible. That's not a verb. A word, I don't think, or even thinking about how you put things into action. That it's just remarkable that you don't say, no, that's not going to be done.
There were some courageous moments, Frida, and there was also some on a whim moments too, where there's 4 other cases of young men. It was always young men that didn't make it across the ice. Mm-hmm. So it's that happened too. And there was also at one point, believe it or not, this is what I really like, a scheduled mail service in the wintertime to the Island Mine Settlement, which was also the county seat. Mm-hmm. But anyway, a dog team was supposed to have left Grand Portage in the morning and arrived at Wendigo mid-morning, and then delivered the mail to this county seat just off Sisquot Bay in late afternoon, and then return the next day. And can you believe that? I mean, there was actually a contract to deliver mail by dog team. Yeah, and it went through all Uncle Sam's contracting specs that you can imagine and groan about, that you were expected to run on time, blah, 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 blah. And,
That's crazy.
Good luck with that.
These stories, Tim, are really fascinating. And Tim Cochrane is our guest on the podcast today. He's retired superintendent of the Grand Portage National Monument and also an author. Just to kind of wrap up with you here today, Tim, your final thoughts about maybe even some stories, secrets, things that you would like to our listeners to know about Grand Portage National Monument, maybe a quick story or something that isn't out there for everybody, maybe something like that. What do you got?
Oh, let's see about Grand Portage National Monument. Okay, well, this one's not a secret, but you have to be kind of a fur trade buff to know this. So, we Americans like to talk about Lewis and Clark, right? The first white explorers that crossed the continent, right?
Mm-hmm.
Sure.
Not so.
No.
Not so. Got it 11 years earlier, Alexander Mackenzie, who was outfitted and was part of the business at Grand Portage, went across the continent and popped out at the Pacific Ocean, roughly where Vancouver is today. So, we get a little parochial about what we talk about, Lewis and Clark, but you gotta, if you're into that kind of thing, first, you need to read up on, he became Sir Alexander Mackenzie. So that would be not a secret, but perhaps something that people don't know about. The other thing that's probably a bit more of a secret is, so when the international border became a little bit better known, or there was threats of that, and there was trouble in paradise because here's a British Canadian company on American soil. Well, there's trouble there. So they decide to move up to what is now Thunder Bay, Ontario. And so what did they do? We're pretty sure, although this hasn't been substantiated too much, they disassembled their buildings and took them apart log by log and brought them up to Fort William.
Wow.
So they took their headquarters apart, and at least some of the buildings, certainly the glass and valuable things, and they reassembled it up, 45 miles further up the shore and safely in British territory.
Tim, you have shared some great stories with us, some great personal experiences, and this really ties in greatly into what we do with the podcast about the stories that are around this big lake of Lake Superior. Certainly, thanks for your time today, and we'll be keeping an eye out for your books. And if people maybe want to find out more about them, is there a way to do that? Do you have a site or at least something where those books would be available?
Most of my books are published by the University of Minnesota Press. So that would be probably the first place to go. Other places to go is a lot of park bookstores in Houghton or Grand Portage, a little less so at Apostles, but park bookstores also carry some of them.
Well, we'll keep an eye out for them, and thank you for your time today.
So wonderful.
Yeah. Tim, this has been great.
Well, it's been fun.
It's Tim Cochrane. He's retired superintendent of Grand Portage National Monument and an author. Frida, that was just a pleasure to chat with him over these last half hour or so. Just so many stories.
Don't you want to just curl up and the list of his books? So he had Borealis and Isle Royale Potpourri. That's back in the 1990s. A Good Boat Speaks for Itself. That's Isle Royale fishermen and their boats. Minong, The Good Place, Ojibwa and Isle Royale. Gitche Bidobig, I'm not saying that correctly. Grand Marais, the early accounts of the Anishinaabe and the North Shore fur trade. And then also now he's working on Making the Carry, The Lives of John and Chickie West Linklater. And then that book that's coming out about the mysteries of Isle Royale.
Yeah.
So, quite a list. He's so prolific.
I also have to say that he was very accurate in talking about with Grand Portage and other indigenous communities that it is not history that does not continue on. As a matter of fact, the indigenous peoples around Lake Superior help keep it going in multiple ways. And maybe we'll talk with them sometime in the future about some of those programs, the Great Lakes Fish and Wildlife Commission and things like that. But the point here, Frida, is that this is showing that the stories continue, the lake is alive, and people are coming here, living on it, working on it, and making it what it is.
It's remarkable. I love where we live, Walt. And we want to hear from our listeners because they know many stories that we haven't uncovered yet. So certainly make a message to the National Parks of Lake Superior Foundation webpage. Let us know what stories in your mind.
You got something you'd like us to talk about, you can find us through the foundation, find us through our Facebook pages and our online. Wherever you're getting this podcast from, you'll find a way to send us a note. But that's going to do it for us for this latest edition of the Lake Superior podcast. I'm Walt Lindala.
I'm Frida Waara. Thanks for listening. The National Parks of Lake Superior Foundation, NPLSF, is the only official nonprofit 501c3 fundraising partner of the National Park Service for all 5 U.S. national park sites on Lake Superior.
To learn more about NPLSF projects and programs, you can visit the website at nplsf.org or friend them on Facebook.
I'm Frida Waara.
And I'm Walt Lindala. Thanks for listening to the Lake Superior podcast.
This podcast made possible with the support of the National Parks of Lake Superior Foundation and Media Brew Communications.
This episode brought to you by Cafe Imports, Minneapolis-based importers of fine specialty green coffees. Independently owned and operated since 1993, Cafe Imports has been dedicated to decreasing its impact on the earth through renewable energy, carbon neutrality, and by supporting conservational efforts in places where quality coffee is grown and also where quality coffee is consumed. Where does your coffee come from?